Hello, Mary Richards.
Hello, Lizzie Lasater.
Welcome to Somatic Self Care, the Somatic Self Care podcast. Would you please start us out with a brief meditation just to ground ourselves before we begin?
Okay, so adjust your body position to improve your comfort by at least 10%. And I'd like you to inhale the breath through the nose and exhale through the nose. Inhale through the nose, exhale through the nose. Inhale and place one hand low on the belly. Inhale again and place the other hand on the chest. And now breathe into your hands and feel the connection between them. Feel the warmth of the inner body. And with the voice of the heart, say to yourself, I am safe. I am powerful. I am present. I am safe. I am powerful. I am present. And with your next inhalation, bring your hands to prayerful mudra at the heart center and rub the hands together vigorously. Generate heat between the hands. Now, if you're wearing glasses, you may need to pause for a moment and slip your glasses off. But rub your hands together, generating friction heat. And when they're warmed to your preference, place the cupped hands lightly over the eyes. And feel the warmth of the hands penetrating through the eyeballs, through the optic nerves into the deep center of the brain. And then let your hands slide gently from your face. Open your eyes and blink several times. And come fully back into the room.
Thank you. Oh, that was lovely. We're continuing with our conversations about the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And we left off at chapter 6, which is the end of part 2. Mary and I have decided to skip over, for the purposes of this series of conversations, to skip over parts 3 and 4, which are titled The Minds of Children and the Imprint of Trauma. Of course, if you're drawn to them, please read those chapters. They're just really beyond the scope of our work as yoga teachers and somatic self-care practitioners. Anything else to say about that jump, Mary?
Yeah, there's definitely value in reading those sections. Just know that they can be really provocative. And if you have experienced traumas related to childhood and the like, please consider reaching out to a certified, mental health professional for support, because you are worthy of care and love, and you may not have been loved and cared for in the way that you needed when you were younger. And now is just another opportunity to meet that need differently for yourself.
Yes. So we're moving now to part 5, which is called Paths to Recovery. And today focusing on chapter 13, Healing from Trauma, Owning Yourself. I'd like to start with a quote, Mary, that leads me into my first question. as I flip the pages back here. Healing from trauma, owning yourself. Here, Dr. van der Kolk writes, trauma is much more than a story about something that happened long ago. The emotions and physical sensations that were imprinted during the trauma are experienced not as memories, but as disruptive physical reactions in the present.
Mm-hmm.
What can we take from that as a community of physical practitioners? The people listening to this are at least, I always say the audience at least owns a yoga mat. Maybe many of us teach yoga. So what does that mean? What does that tell us? This idea that trauma is actually embedded in the body?
It is in my opinion, a modern reiteration of, ancient yoga texts that date back, from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali to the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and things like that, which basically operates, Hatha Yoga, the principle behind asana is that we actually can't achieve enlightenment and spiritual liberation if there's pain and suffering in the body, which is why most of us start start yoga with asana practice on the mat. And Bessel van der Kolk really just hits that nail on the head once again, because, we've discussed in previous chats that all trauma is pre-verbal. So it's not like you can tell a coherent narrative about trauma because of its nature. And so the body tells a narrative through pain, tension, neuromuscular disorganization, issues with coordination and movement patterning. And asana has, in my opinion, in my reading of various practice texts, asana has always been designed to alleviate those disruptions, because those disruptions keep us from ourselves.
I love that as a kind of viewpoint. In my work with you and through reading this book, I have become fascinated with the word interoception. I'd say that's my new that's my new word that I use every time I teach asana. He writes, Dr. van der Kolk writes, the only way we can consciously access the emotional brain is through self-awareness, i.e., by activating the medial prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that notices what is going on inside of us, and thus allows us to feel what we are feeling. The technical term for this is interoception, which is Latin for looking inside. Can you talk a little bit about interoception and why it is so important?
Oh, you mean pratyahara? No, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because interoception is pratyahara. Pratyahara isn't a withdrawal from the world around us. It's drawing our senses, consolidating our senses to the space within us. And that's what interoception is, because the reality is, if we're not paying attention to how we feel, we're lying to ourselves. Brene Brown talks about this a lot, actually. And I say this all the time as well. We think we're cognitive beings, but we're emotional beings. Everything about our neurobiology is most of our neurobiology, I don't like to use absolutist terms really, but most of our neurobiology is oriented toward emotion. Emotional integration, emotional regulation, emotional processing. And it's the emotions that inform our thinking. And so to really connect to how we feel, we're not going to find the answers in our prefrontal cortex or our hippocampus. We're not going to find the answers in our memories and the narratives we tell ourselves. We're going to find our light by going into the dark recesses of the body and noticing where we have discomfort, where an emotion lives within us, where when we think of a memory, a disturbing memory, where do we feel it in our bodies? Because the more aware we become, the more fluent we become in mapping our emotional experience in the context of our physical experience, because everything happens in our bodies. That's how we become more attuned to ourselves, how we become more cognitively accurate. And so if we want to change how we feel, we first have to feel the feeling itself and where it lives within our physicality and how that physicality then plays out in our neurology.
Yeah, there's a striking fact in this chapter that I kept rereading and underlining, and it's that, quote, some 80% of the fibers of the vagus nerve, which connects the brain with many internal organs, are afferent. That is, they run from the body into the brain. This means that we can directly train our arousal systems by the way we breathe, chant, and move.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find it so fascinating that he, you know, in what I just read, those two sentences, he is connecting both the scientific understanding of the vagus nerve and these nerve tracts with these, what we would consider very old techniques of human regulation, of regulating our nervous systems, breathing, chanting, and moving. I mean, we've been dancing around the fire back into time. It's toddlers at the door. How do you see that, Mary, that fact about 80% being afferent?
Yeah, this isn't surprising. Again, this is science catching up to our reality. You know, our architecture, our neurological architecture is designed for relationship. So of course, the wanderer, the vagus nerve, which affects our facial expressions, the tone and rhythm of our voice, the pace and rhythm of our breath and our heart rate, how our small intestine, how our peristaltic actions in the GI tract are working. It makes so much sense to me because we are basically walking mirrors.
Exactly. And what he writes about in this chapter is the transitory nature of emotions. That's something I continue to learn in my middle age, that how I'm feeling right now is not a static state. Whether I'm feeling overwhelmed or angry or frustrated or exhausted, whatever the feeling tone is. And interestingly, Dr. van der Kolk points out that mindfulness as a tool puts us in touch with, quote, the transitory nature of our feelings and perceptions. When we pay focused attention to our bodily sensations, we can recognize the ebb and flow of our emotions, and with that, increase our control over them. I think that's such an elegant definition. I love what he's doing in linking the science side through, breathing, chanting, movement in through to mindfulness. What does that make you think about this idea of the transitory nature?
It's a relief, okay? Because especially when we're talking about trauma, like how do you differentiate a really unpleasant experience from a traumatic one? Well, it's how the experience affects the nervous system function. How we process, how we experience what's happening to us, how we process it. And so one of the things that's most helpful in dealing with trauma is by focusing on breath and body sensations, and then also correlating physical sensations with emotions, with our feeling state, it really emphasizes to us in a factual way, because we're feeling it right here, right now. We feel the vagaries, the shifts, the chameleon-like nature of our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions. And that's profoundly helpful to folks who are wrestling with trauma, with post-traumatic stress and things like that, is because it reminds us that the trauma is not happening right now, that what we're feeling right now is exactly that. They're feelings. What's happened has happened. It's over, but we're having these feelings, and they're not going to last forever.
Right.
But see, to get rid of them, not to get rid of them, but to move, to put them in that context of this is temporary, and these feelings of helplessness, of fear, of panic, they will dissipate if we pay attention to them. Because if we deny them, they will keep knocking on the door of our attention until we invite them into our present awareness so that they can burn themselves out. So the more we deny our feelings, the more pressure we're putting on ourselves, and the more we're disassociating from our ability to let things go.
I love that. And I love seeing our yoga practices as a container for real-time feeling what's going on, sensation-wise, emotion-wise, body-wise.
I mean, this is the intention, you know. Okay, if we look at the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, okay, so Sutra 1 we know is Atha Yoga Anushasanam, you know, and now an explication of yoga begins, right? And now, Atha, and now. That's how the Yoga Sutra itself begins. And now, welcome to the present moment. And then we move on to Yoga's Chittas Vrittis Narodhaha. Yoga is the cessation of the modulations of the mind. Right off the bat. See, it's not the cessation of the modulations of the mind so that we become thoughtless, blank vistas of awareness, so to speak. You know, no, it's the cessation of these modulations that keep repeating themselves because we haven't interacted with them. We haven't actually looked at them and said, are you true, accurate, helpful, honest, etc. So yoga from the beginning has been about welcoming more of ourselves into our awareness so that we can let it go.
He also says in this chapter, safety and terror are incompatible, meaning that those two nervous system states cannot exist at the same time in our body, safety and terror. There's also an idea I've heard before, probably from mom, that anxiety and relaxation cannot exist in the body at the same time. So in thinking about restorative yoga or trauma-informed yoga teaching, Mary, what are the things that you do, the techniques, the strategies, the mental frameworks that you have when you teach to try to create an environment of safety for your students?
The first thing I do in any teaching dynamic, even, when we started this conversation, my invitation was to ground, to become centered in our sensations, in our breath right now in this present moment, because trauma, those emotions live in the past and the future. And see, well, you obviously can't change what has happened, and we don't know what will happen. So to help us feel safe, to co-create conditions that we perceive as safe, I begin with grounding in physical presence, right here, right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I also do things like asking before I touch anyone at every time I touch them. I think that, for example, it's something I learned from mom. It's such a great, it's not just for the person that I'm asking if I may touch, but it signals to everyone who's there that I'm going to extend that same courtesy to them. So that if their eyes are covered in a restorative pose, for example, and they're giving them permission to let go more deeply, they don't think I'm going to come by and, touch their head, their feet, their heart.
Push their shoulders down into the floor and things like that. Yeah, no, not only do I ask for consent, I explicitly share with the person how I would like to touch them, where I would like to touch them, why I would like to touch them. So let's say we're in downward facing dog, and I say to the person, because they're in downward facing dog, right? So they may only see my feet, and I'll come up and I'd say, I would like to place my hands on your shoulder blades. Because I'd like to invite you to breathe into your shoulder blades through my hands. I'd like you to guide you into that. May I touch you in that way? And the person's like, yeah, thanks. Because by telling people what you'd like to do and what your intention is, you're not imposing your power over them. You're inviting them to share power with you. And that is one of the most important things we can do as yoga teachers, especially when we're working with people in a restorative context or a pranayama context. And if we know that we are explicitly working with people who are in trauma-informed yoga class, we have to cultivate conditions for agency.
Absolutely. That's what I was thinking of bringing up as you were speaking, is that when I ask, may I touch you? It's almost like I think it's valuable if the student says yes, and it's valuable if the student says no. Because if they say no, it's giving them a great chance to practice making a boundary. And I always receive that super softly and just say like, okay, no, no humiliation, no peer pressure, no coercion. It's like, no, I'm so glad that you had the opportunity and almost a playful place where someone's really asking and you're able to step into that power over your body. Because, as you say, I mean, a trauma-informed yoga class, I assume any yoga class I'm teaching, if there's 10 people, 20 people, 30 people there, I'm assuming that there are many people who have experienced trauma.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So let's just right off the bat, let's operate from profoundly humane, democratic principles of mutuality, cooperation, and respect.
Amen. The last point I wanted to bring up from this chapter, unless you had anything else, Mary, to add, is this quote where Dr. van der Kolk says, being traumatized is not just an issue of being stuck in the past. It is just as much a problem of not being fully alive in the present. So as yoga practitioners, yoga teachers, in some ways, that's our métier. That's what we're encouraging, offering, sharing, teaching, practicing, is a glimpse of being in the present or stepping towards the present. So thinking of that so many of us who've had trauma experiences are caught in the past and unable to fully inhabit the present. What can we do? What are your practices, your daily practices for encouraging yourself, especially when you're feeling triggered? How do you encourage yourself to come back into the present?
Bear with me for a moment. taking care of myself right now. Because trauma, I do live with trauma. And I've been in a trauma state for over a week now. And so I've been using a lot of these practices. And one of the most helpful things for me, because see, cognitively, when you're triggered, you know that the trauma is not happening again, but that doesn't matter. The thinking brain doesn't matter because your nervous system and your emotional perception systems have been turned on in such a way that your thinking brain can't be heard. And so it's the way that you can unload that sympathetic nervous system response and move in the direction of equanimity and calm is to actually look around, look to the left, look to the right, look to the center, look in front of you, and name the things that you see. For instance, right now I'm looking to my left and I see photos from when I went to trapeze school with my girlfriends. And I see my headstander and my Iyengar yoga chair and my desk lamp and my vase of pens and goniometers, which I use to measure range of motion. And then when I look to my right, I see my meditation chair and my weight stack and my box of journals. And so this is what I do for myself. I root myself in the present. And sometimes focusing on the sensations of the breath when you're in a triggered state isn't actually possible. It's because you might be so activated that you actually cannot catch your breath. And so by looking around you and pausing and naming 5 things that you see to your right, to your left, in front of you, even looking behind you, that will situate you in the present moment. And I rely on that a lot.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that technique with us and your honest, open heart that you have been in a state of healing for the past week. We so appreciate you being here with us, Mary. Anything you want to share before we close?
I would say that, emotions can be scary, especially when you're triggered and you're having flashbacks and sympathetic nervous system arousal that is really evocative of the trauma experience itself. And what I think it's important to tell ourselves as often as we can is that feelings of helplessness, for instance, don't mean that you're helpless. Feelings don't mean that your reality is one of danger. Okay? They're feelings. Feel them. Because the more we feel into them, the more accurately able we are to respond to our present situation.
Thank you. Where can we find you on the internet, Mary Richards?
You can find me across the board at yogawithmaryrichards.com.
Yes. And I'm at lizzie.yoga, LIZZIE.yoga. Please sign up for my free newsletter, Rest with Lizzie Lasater. Lots of love, Mary.
Right back at you, Lizzie.